Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Yuyun Wahyuningrum. I'm very happy to be in this ALTERSEA online conference, 7th to 10 July 2021, and this is panel 4A, Political Participation. My paper is entitled Contesting the State in the Time of Pandemic, Trajectories of Civil Society in Southeast Asia. I would like to first start it with presenting to you the research problem and objective. Countries have different responses to address the pandemic, such as physical distancing policies, movement control, lockdowns, curfews, quarantine, and state of emergency. My research question is how have the nature of coronavirus and the way Southeast Asian government responded to the pandemic reshape the relations between the state and civil society. The objectives of uh, this research are to assess the changing forms of state and civil society relationship in the time of pandemic, especially on the area of autonomy, participation, partnership, and solidarity. And second objective of this study is to investigate if the shifting relations contribute to civil society strategies choices, tactics, objectives, and modes of action to engage the state during the pandemic. Information for this research or data that gathered for this research come from media coverage and literature and recorded online seminars. For this draft, I have not been able to interview the key actors, but I will do later. My initial argument for this paper is that pandemic has reshaped the complex relations between state and society. Despite all restriction through several legal and on civil liberties, there has been an increased social engagement in the context of health crisis responses. There are 7 trends that emerge from these responses as I have observed in the last 1 year. First, using public health crisis to reason the tougher restriction on civil space, activities, and organizations. Second, legalized restriction on civil liberties. The third, despite restriction, street protests remain with some conditions. Fourth, challenging narratives and disinformation about pandemic. And then fifth, new negotiated space and initiatives for humanitarian responses. Six, expanding and repurpose advocacy group to address welfare issues. And seventh, community participation on organized relief efforts. These are the 7 trends that I observe from the responses of the state or governments in the last 1 year um, in Southeast Asia. I would like to go one by one quickly. First, on using a health crisis to reason the tougher restriction on civil space, activities, and organizations. Restriction on meetings between civil society organizations and parliaments on the ground of health protection has been repetitively mentioned in number of media and news media. And this restriction impacted the enjoyment of freedom of movement, expression, opinion, peaceful assembly, religion, access to information, the right to health, work, education, and privacy, including press freedom, right to food, housing, and personal security, which have limited civil society advocacy for fundamental rights, reinforcing a trend that exists before the pandemic. These restrictions also silence civic and democratic criticism of government's pandemic responses and move social and political activism from offline to online. Second, on the legalized restriction on civil liberties, for instance, through imposing state of emergency law, as well as laws on fake news that has been used to crack down on government critics, press charges against online critics of government's crisis management, charge anti-government protesters, go after opponents, circumvent parliamentary check on executive power, and limit the public backlash against allegations of government's involvement in human rights violations, including the forced disappearance of an exiled activist who, who was critical to the government. On the third observation, despite restriction, street protests remain with condition. In Thailand, for instance, young people leading nationwide protests against the regime since March 2020. The demand has been varied from demanding the prime minister resignation and demanding democratic reform, as well as demanding the reform in the monarchy. These kind of protests also happen in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar, with different scale of protests. The fourth observation is that civil society challenged the narrative and uh, work on disinformation about pandemic, challenging disinformation about pandemic, as has been seen in Philippines, Malaysia, as well as Indonesia, by providing fact-checking information on the pandemic and hold governments accountable during the crisis. The fifth observation is that there has been a new negotiated spaces and initiatives for humanitarian responses. So, for instance, in Malaysia, the movement control order barred civil society or organization or NGOs to distribute humanitarian assistance to those who need the support, such as migrants, refugees, refugee population. But after NGOs launched a campaign called Let Us Work With You, the government adjusted the order to allow NGOs to distribute food and other emergency supplies to affected communities. This is also found in Indonesia, Philippines, as well as in Thailand. The sixth observation is that expanding the and repurpose advocacy groups to address the welfare issues. Many groups that not addressing the issue of humanitarian crisis have been taken responsibility to do some welfare issues, such as we can find it in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and Cambodia. In Thailand, for instance, student activists who launched anti-junta campaigns before the pandemic have partly shifted to humanitarian work by distributing food packs to the unemployed, dwellers, and affected sex workers. In Myanmar, some ethnic minority activists have reoriented themselves from human rights campaigns to health advocacy and service provision, including by distributing food and other basic goods in remote areas. In the Philippines, human rights groups have reshaped human rights discourses in terms of people working together out of generosity to achieve a common goals and a shared sense of identity and treating others with respect and dignity. In Singapore, Pink Dot, the LGBT movement that campaigned for recognition and equality, has extended its support to migrant workers by raising funds for and delivering care packages to many of those who were trapped in their dormitories because of coronavirus restriction. Similar initiative also found in Indonesia as well as in Cambodia. The seventh observation uh, in last year in responding to the coronavirus, there has been community participation on organized relief efforts. In Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, charity groups were set up to raise funds to buy medical supplies and food for slum dwellers, disabled people, and also to migrant workers. In Indonesia, for instance, tech startup launch crowdfunding campaigns to raise funds for informal sector workers to buy personal protective equipment or PPE for healthcare workers. Similarly, in Myanmar, NGOs as well as religious organizations and local companies have provided food and other emergency supplies for the needy, filling gaps left by the state. Some religious worship places also allow the religious compound to be used as quarantine centers. In the Philippines, citizens have come together to make PPE for frontline health professionals, distributed food packs for the homeless, and made cash transfers to the unemployed. In Cambodia, civil society organization and business tycoon have made donations to support the government efforts and counter coronavirus. So, with these initial observations, this paper would like to argue that despite the fact that all restrictions imposed for civil society and society in general, there has been a number of increased social engagement in the context of health crisis responses. Thank you very much.